back on so that we're running
Oh,
live. So now it's the recording has started. And I will slowly get started with the introduction and just say that my name is Mark Schwartz, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Conservation Science in Practice, and I'm standing in as the host for today's seminar, which I'm very excited about. It should be very interesting. Martin Strauss has been organizing the series of talks this spring, and it's been a very exciting set of talks. And you can go online and look at the upcoming talks. There's several of them coming up through April and into May. But today we have with us two of the authors of the paper, Understanding and Responding to the Environmental Human Rights Defender Crisis, the Case for Conservation Action. That is in press at Conservation Letters. We have Peter Biel Larsen, who is a senior lecturer with the Environmental Governance and Territorial Development Institute at the Universities of Zurich and Geneva. And Philippe Lebion, who's at the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia. And Peter will be doing the main presentation today. But Philippe will jump in and assist with information as we go along. So with that, I'm going to also remind you that we are recording this session, and so it'll be up on the Society for Conservation Biology's website afterwards. And that we'll have time for questions at the end. And so I ask everybody to mute themselves during the presentation. If they have a burning question for clarification, drop it in the chat. At the end of the talk, we'll have plenty of time for questions, we hope. And again, you can drop your questions into chat or raise your hand and we'll ask them directly. But with that, I think I can mute myself and hand it over to you, Peter. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the kind introduction, and indeed also thanks to Martin and other colleagues for inviting us to present our recent article in this series on emerging issues in conservation, organized by the Society for Conservation Biology. And I think it's really important for us to speak in this forum for a number of different reasons. First of all, you have a huge membership. We have a huge membership organization here, combining both natural and social scientists, many of which indeed I think are faced with some of the issues that we'll be talking about today, many more than we actually think. And this is one of the points that I want to actually address towards the end of the talk. And also because the Society of Conservation Biology does play a critical role in that connection between science and policy on a number of key issues that we're facing, key negotiations that we're also facing this year in terms of post-2020 biodiversity framework, and how basically to link science and policy, and looking at that, the human rights dimension in that respect, and in particular looking at the human rights of environmental human rights defenders is what we'd like to talk about today. And so I'm very happy also to have Philippe Lebion as one of the co-authors of this collective piece. Indeed, one of the first things that I'd like to basically say for introducing this topic and introducing our article, which we entitled Understanding and Responding to the Environmental Human Rights Defender Crisis, the Case for Conservation Action, is that it was and is a collective effort that where the article itself in Conservation Letters is part of an ongoing process. Philippe is one of the co-authors, Mary Menton, Jose Aylwin, Jörg Balziger, David Boyd, Michel Forst, Fran Lambrick, Claude Lise Santos, and Hannah Story, Susan Wilding are other members, as well as a number of other participants in what we've entitled the Geneva Roadmap effort. So why do I insist a bit on this collective effort? Because what we've seen in recent years has been also a bit of a mushrooming in terms of both different research initiatives, NGO activities, but also UN efforts to address what we call the environmental human rights defenders crisis. So what I'd like to talk about a bit today is a bit about what we actually know, or some of the dimensions we know about it, but also where there are some knowledge gaps. I would also like to talk about some of the responses to the current crisis and efforts to coordinate and build synergies. And finally, I'd also address a bit the role of Society for Conservation Biology. I'd also like to leave a bit of time for Philippe to introduce a number of other key efforts, including research and publication efforts that are in the making, which I think deserve our attention. So who are we actually talking about when we talk about environmental human rights defenders? I've here listed the definition that we refer to that came up in a UN Special Rapporteur report as of individuals and groups who in their personal or professional capacity and in a peaceful manner strive to protect and promote human rights relating to the environment, including water, air, land, flora, and fauna. And as such, of course, a deep and clear connection to the field of conservation biology. So the article that we've written is basically about trying to pull together in a fairly short, concise manner an assessment of what we know already, the understanding of the issues, the challenges, but also what we know about approaches to respond to this crisis and what that entails for collective efforts to actually respond and transform some of these dynamics. Again, it's a collective effort. We entitled it the Geneva Roadmap initially because we met up in Geneva just before COVID really set in and disabled all sorts of travel. So this is almost like a historical significant picture in that we were actually standing there together without protective gear or anything, without the so-called social distance. And it has, for many of us, it was the last time we were actually able to travel internationally and meet up in person. These are figures that many of you have seen already, but they are, of course, the particularly dramatic result in some cases where land and environmental defenders end up being killed because of their efforts to protect the environment. The Global Witness reports is referred to a lot, has been mediatized a lot, but again, it deserves mentioning, of course. On average, 4 defenders being killed every week since the climate change agreement in 2015. And of course, certain hotspots or certain countries that are particularly, where killings are particularly rampant, Colombia, Philippines are mentioned here, but we could also mention other countries where this appears in perhaps a less mediatized scale, but is also apparent. So these are obviously things to think about. Now, a key element and focus on this report and the article there was to say that all of this is only the tip of an iceberg in terms of the kinds of threats and forms of violence that environmental defenders experience. Before actually things accelerating or escalating into killings, there are a host of other forms of threats and violence that are experienced, which very often go undocumented, but are far more widespread and concern much larger numbers of people. That's one side of it, of the tip of the iceberg argument. The second dimension of the tip of the iceberg argument is that there, of course, are many blind spots where there's actually poor documentation of people being killed because of environmental efforts, or simply without having civil society organizations or human rights institutions documenting it or making the linkage. So this is of course very important because the risk is constantly of these issues and these people going under the radar. Now there are a number of complex drivers that produce these situations of violence in the conservation field itself, but very often also in extraction, agribusinesses, and in particular governance situations. So Philippe might also want to elaborate a bit more on that later in terms of some of the particular governance constellations that seem to enable or create conditions that are more dangerous, so to speak. One thing that the article also really emphasizes is the transforming situation here. We're facing civil society spaces that are melting. In recent reports, again, we mentioned here the 2018 one, but there are more recent ones from Civicus as well, showing how civic spaces are degrading and human rights are being violated. So these are some of the issues that we highlight. Other things could be raised also in terms of the numbers, in terms of the kinds of issues experienced. And notably, one could also draw attention to 2020 and the whole COVID dynamic, which really transformed that year of 2020 from being a super year for biodiversity to indeed resulting in a kind of triple crisis, where we see a number of social environmental actors being disproportionately affected by COVID. On the one hand, the case of indigenous peoples, for example, but also the way that environmental defenders have become easy targets during the lockdown, which has in a sense become also a crackdown for environmental human rights defenders. And the third dynamic of that triple crisis under the COVID that we see is a growing number of resource pressures, at least in some countries, where certain concessions and so on have intensified as part of economic recovery situations, and of course then intensifying the underlying conflicts that are leading to the kinds of violence that we're talking about today. So here references, for example, to the kinds of crackdowns we're seeing on environmental defender activists in the case of Philippines are good examples of that. Now, I also wanted to here making reference to the news production by websites like Manga Bay, and just really make that connection to conservation biology, because we shouldn't forget, of course, that conservation biologists and their partners are indeed victims and have continued to be victims in this process, and have been so in 2020. Conservationists themselves, students, researchers, their guides, public officials, indigenous representatives, the people we are working as researchers and conservation practitioners, the places we work and the people whom we work with, whether as social or natural scientists, are in many places being targeted. Just on this little page, which I copied here, for example, there's reference to a Mexican outstanding biology student serving as a guide for scientists being assassinated in 2020, 21 years old. Now, and there are, of course, other cases like the cases of Iran, where we've seen conservationists being convicted for spying and spending years in prison, which again illustrates that we're not just talking about killings here, we're talking about imprisonment, persecution, other forms of violence. This is part of the reality of many of our colleagues in many countries. And here in this case, in the Iranian case, scholars and researchers from the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation faced somewhere between 4 to 10 years of imprisonment because of this, having been arrested in 2018. This is from early 2020 when this was upheld. So based on that little brief introduction, I just wanted also to briefly spend a few minutes to show you a video that we did about from the Geneva roadmap process, just to give also leave space for some of the testimonies from some of our defender representatives who were present then, and let their voice also be conveyed in this meeting. So let me switch to that now. And I've got the sound going, and I'll try to expand the screen, and here we go. Sorry.
We are easy targets.
If you keep silent, it doesn't help.
It's very important for us to, as environmental defenders, to unite. Environmental defenders mostly are people like indigenous peoples, peasants, fisher folks whose daily lives is interlinked with the environment, with their land, with the sea. So these are, naturally, even they don't know, they are the environmental defenders.
Desde que o meu irmão, José Cláudio, e minha cunhada foram assassinados em 2011, nós lutamos por justiça. Muitos dos companheiros estão sofrendo ameaças de morte como eu. Em outubro do ano passado, nós recebemos 2 cartas de ameaça de morte direta, dizendo que vai matar. Um telefonema não é capaz de fazer a segurança da vida de um defensor. E eu temo pela minha vida, pela vida das minhas filhas, pela vida das minhas irmãs, dos meus irmãos.
I feel like it's worth living if you do what you feel is important. I'm going against some people in the government and the companies that are destroying the environment. There is no proper jurisdictional system in Russia, so you basically you are under the threat like all the time because of the police that can violate human rights.
Abuse and violence committed by forces you expect not to be the perpetrators but the protector of their rights, but in reality they are the ones who are violating. We have no choice but to fight back, push back to gain that democratic space.
We were evicted from our ancestral home. The Sengwer community is not against conservation. We are the best conservators. We are the people who understand what the forest needs. We are beekeeping community. We are hunters. That is our way of life. We are the people that can address the issues of the climate change. We know how to take care of the forest.
I really feel better when I unite with other people that are concerned about the same problems as me. I think to do activism to care for climate, people who are not protected, like activists, they should be protected first, so they can have the freedom to express their opinion on the climate change and on the other issues. So without this, it's just no space for civil society, no space for the action, no space for the change.
The struggle for the environment is a struggle for the people.
Nothing about us without us. We are sticking to that theme.
Uma floresta sozinha, ela não é capaz de se defender. E ela precisa de nós para continuar em pé. E é exatamente a nós que eles estão atacando. Se o mundo começar a pressionar o governo Bolsonaro quanto à vida dos seus defensores, quanto à vida da floresta, eu tenho certeza que nós seremos olhados de outra forma.
I'm appalled by the lack of action. Believe me, I've been moved by all those testimonies of the victims that tells us the attacks, the threat that are facing from so many actors. There has been a lot of literature written on the topic, NGOs, academics, the UN as well. We have very strong resolution adopted, and now it's time to deliver. It's time to implement and to join our efforts to make sure that those who are on the forefront of the battle will not face any more threats and attacks by different actors. So the Geneva Roadmap is the first step by which all we could join our efforts.
We see diverse crisis patterns across the world, so it's time to listen now, it's time to act. And this is also what has brought many of us together to start thinking about a Geneva roadmap for collective action, engaging many of the organizations, many of the defenders, many of the researchers, academia as well. 2 days of debates, engaging UN special rapporteurs, and we were also attempting to learn from defenders.
So the roadmap itself is based on initiatives which are underway. Who is doing what? How are we going to do? What are the collective targets we want to reach? The first one is to reverse the tide, the need to have a civic social space. We also worked on how to bridge actions and also sometimes to bridge vocabulary so that we can understand and work together much better. We also worked on how to break isolation and to provide more access to protection. How do we think we are going to protect the environment if we kill or put in jail or harass those who are protecting the environment?
One of the most important human rights of the 21st century is the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So we have an opportunity in 2020 to make a great leap forward in terms of recognizing the right to a healthy environment, which in turn would empower environmental human rights defenders.
You know, what environmental defenders are doing, actually what communities are doing, what indigenous peoples are doing, defending the rights to their lands and defending nature, is a job that they're doing on behalf of all of us. When we think about nature, you think about these beautiful places, and they're the ones taking care every day of those places. I truly believe that we have to realize that this is everybody's job, and that we have some champions on the field. This should be in our veins, because without nature, humanity will not thrive. We call for appropriate justice. We call for the respect of the human rights, and for people to understand that we all depend on nature. We call for decisive measures helping the ones that right now are putting themselves at risk to protect natural resources that we depend on.
Se nós nos calarmos, outros defensores serão assassinados.
All right. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join that visioning of the film made by Mélanie Emonet, trying to convey the spirit of what the bigger picture of what this article also forms part of. Indeed, there was a deep reflection also that took place in the article, but also in the meetings around how are we actually doing in terms of protecting environmental defenders. On the one hand, acknowledging the growing number of domestic and international efforts, but very often also a gap between the kinds of existing mechanisms for protection and those at risk. And I think this is something that many in the conservation audience would probably acknowledge. Also, for example, with the protection mechanisms located in urban centers, reaching out to individuals very far from the rural areas and the places where the real conservation challenges are taking place. At the same time, clearly growing experiences with protocols of action, protection measures, whether it's through embassies or whether it's through domestic institutions, but also deep discussions happening around how do we actually address both the risks that may be of more of an individual nature, but also address the community, the collective protection needs and efforts, both from a positive and negative side. Now, one of the interesting things that the meeting clearly also highlighted, and we also stress in the article, is the issue of are two issues. One was the issue of the need to address the root causes and drivers actually creating these situations in the first place, whether they concern socioeconomic, resource-related pressures, or whether it's related to particular governance constellations and so on. And the second dynamic that also came out was the importance of really engaging with defenders themselves in understanding what is helpful and what is needed, rather than having some kind of supply-driven approach to what might be a good idea, but not really afford any protection in practice. So those were some of the issues that we raised. Again, as the film shows, we ended up having out of a massive set of discussions, 4 goals that came out: how to actually reverse this tide of marginalization and how to stop the attacks. No, and we kept, again, environmental actors here as a fairly open category, to not necessarily make distinctions between who, but rather actually being open to the ones that were affected and ones that are engaging in peaceful environmental protection, but are subject to attacks. The second one was related very much towards the issue of civic spaces, as we saw, that are increasingly closing in, closing down, that are degrading, but the importance of maintaining those dynamics of enabling civic spaces, environmental rights overall to engage and have accountability in place. And the third was about bridging initiatives, cooperation, and finally, the fourth one about breaking isolation and securing effective access to protection. Again, something that I think we in the conservation community know very well, working very often in isolated settings. So based on those, were the article addresses a number of very specific set of actions and policy recommendations also for the negotiation of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. We won't have time to get into it here, but the core message is the importance of saying we're not going to have an effective and nor an equitable biodiversity framework for after 2020 if we don't actually have a strong policy emphasis on protecting those that stand up for biodiversity in the first place. So here we really have a message that is extremely important and still not at all guaranteed in the negotiation process up to the 2020 framework. I think a number of conservation organizations are stepping up action in this respect, but we need more support. And we're very thankful indeed to have the opportunity to speak in this setting. One of I wanted to give a couple of practical examples as well of what we have done, and also see some of my IUCN colleagues in present here tonight or today. One was with the IUCN network, notably the Commission on Environmental, Economic and Social Policy, with whom we have had a very important dialogue as well, discussing this framework and exploring what it actually meant, translating the policy recommendations from our conservation letters piece into practical responses and possibilities for the IUCN. And there are a number of things that can be said in that respect, but let's just focus in on 2021 as the year of the World Conservation Congress, where hopefully a new resolution on protecting environmental, human and people's rights defenders and whistleblowers will be adopted. It will be discussed, and we need, of course, all the support we can get to have that adopted. Some of the things that this new resolution would address would include a firm involvement of the IUCN program, different elements, including the business component, moving towards having an IUCN policy and action plan on this topic, annual reporting, but also strengthened dialogue with individual state members where there are challenges faced by environmental defenders. So this is something very concrete that we also look forward to. Of course, in a context of, if we look at the roadmap, where isolation of and attacks against defenders continues to be deepening in the COVID situation, we've seen how the civic spaces continue to degrade. I would say one of the positive lights is the growing number of defender initiatives and cooperation that show that new things can be done. There are a number of new initiatives that are being undertaken, both multilaterally, but also by NGOs. But still, we have to acknowledge that many defenders continue to remain under the radar and are not yet in a situation with adequate nor effective protection measures reaching out. So we have some level of responsibility, all of us, in trying to pass this message on and find solutions to that. We had a meeting recently co-organized with the Geneva Environmental Network, Earth Justice, and the University of Geneva, and the Geneva Roadmap Initiative, just to spell out some of the key opportunities that we see in 2021, despite the COVID situation. Here we could mention the Escazú Agreement, which now has been ratified by enough countries and has specific wording for Latin America and Caribbean countries. We could mention the COP26 on climate change related, the World Conservation Congress we mentioned, the Aarhus Convention, but of course also speaking here to a conservation biology audience as well, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the negotiations taking place there with the open-ended working group, where there are key questions about how human rights and biodiversity linkages will be made. We think it's a key opportunity, again, to really make sure that defender issues are highlighted in terms of a target or a cross-cutting enabling condition. We'll see how this evolves in the next months to the run-up to Kunming in China. But this is, again, something I think where the society perhaps might consider also having a word to say on this. So I would like to end on just a couple of words about the connection to the Society for Conservation Biology. I mean, plus 4,000 membership, and really, if we look at the mission and the priorities of the society, we see, of course, responding to member needs. And in some of the work that we've been doing with conservation professionals, we've seen that many indeed keep all of this to themselves, but are facing a number of challenges. And historically, we've seen a lot of analysis pointing out that this is in part due not only to the research role, but of course the active policy role that many conservation researchers take up, whether it's through local associations, whether it's through working as guides, through conservation NGOs, or through public roles supporting ministries of environment and so on, often face challenges indeed in terms of threats and harassment and so on. And this might be something indeed that I'm sure that the society has already been addressed, but perhaps I would say now there's real momentum to start considering this in perhaps an even more strategic way. I would like here to refer to the analysis also of Scheidel and a number of other co-authors, pointing to how 40% of the 2,743 cases of environmental conflicts that they studied actually involve scientists and professionals, which might come as a surprise to many, but just shows the kinds of high-risk situations that conservation researchers may also easily find themselves in, particularly when they have some level of public engagement, with many, of course, do. So I've already raised this once. I mean, in terms of the Iranian case, there are many others. The point here, and I'd like to end here and just pass the word on to Philippe also to mention a few things. But I think there's room for policy action from the Society for Conservation Biology, looking internally in terms of its membership. Perhaps we could work together towards documenting the kinds of challenges experienced by the membership in different parts of the world. But it's also about recognizing the needs of protection among membership itself, as well as partners. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in that respect, looking at the Society of Conservation Biology as an actor of solidarity, even reaching out to communities in places where it works and so on, and exploring that. So environmental defenders as a new policy priority, and perhaps even a statement from the Society of Conservation Biology in the current global negotiations, for example, in the run-up to the post-2020 biodiversity framework, would be an extremely important signal, both for, indeed in that whole science policy space that we're working in. So from me, I would just say, again, thank you for this opportunity to actually talk about this. And then I'd like to, if Philippe, if you don't mind, to say a few words about some of the work you're doing, including also a couple of key publications that will come out soon from your side.
Felipe,
Yeah,
you're
thank you very much. Yeah. Mark, is it okay for me? Just a few minutes, maybe? Okay, I'm just going to look at my notes. Very quickly, I'm a prof at the University of British Columbia. I've got a long history of collaborations with environmental and human rights organizations like Global Witness. And I came to work on environmental defenders precisely because some of the people we were working with were the targets or even killed in the midst of collaborations. And so this is something that really arose around the 2010s as a little bit like journalists had done for Reporters Without Borders, so trying to get to know what's the global picture and what can be done about it. It's a complex questions very often, especially on the part of, I think, the conservation community. And I think there is a need, and it comes through some of the people we work with and researchers that will be publishing in our papers. There's also a need for a kind of introspections on the part of the conservation community, because they are sometimes victims. We can think of conservationists who've been killed by logging gangs, for example. But at the same time, they can also be themselves, especially park wardens, perpetrators of human rights abuses. Especially if we take a broad definition of environmental defenders, which for many people in the human rights circles consider environmental and land defenders. And I think there is a second step to take after introspection is understanding who needs to be recognized as an environmental defenders. And I understand that for a conservationist, sometimes it's not always easy to recognize local communities as environmental defenders. There's very little tradition of doing that in many ways. But at the same time, the what human rights people see as environmental defenders, they often don't see themselves as really environmental activists. What they really try to do is protect what they come to call, for example, territories of life, combining community, livelihoods, territories. They try to defend the world that they know and seek to maintain for their children. Especially vis-a-vis processes that they see as top-down, as harmful, without proper consultation, etc. So while the bulk of this comes from extractive companies, mining projects, big dam projects, etc., there can also be problems arising from conservation, mainstream conservation initiatives. And in that respect, some of the work that will be highlighted in this special issue is also the connections that we've observed sometimes between conservation organizations and extractive companies. So we've got things looking at, for example, biodiversity offsets or partnership with oil companies. So very often for the conservation communities, it's a way to raise funds, it's a way to get political access, to get to extend maybe their realm for action, but it can also have negative consequences for local communities. The third point I wanted to bring is regarding the role of the conservation community for the condemnation of attacks when they happen. And in this respect, the IUCN resolution is really great, and the new one that will come up will further update and consolidate that. But sometimes we see the condemnations taking place when it's really professional conservationists, park wardens. We can think about the thin green line type of initiative, but they don't always recognize the broad range of environmental defenders that are under attack. And that's also what the paper that Peter and I and the group wrote have a bit of a call. And the last point, of course, is coordination. There is, and I must acknowledge, some real unease among some of the most activist organizations in human rights circles about conservationists, because they see those conservation organizations as human rights abusers. And so sometimes we had people saying, we don't want to work with IUCN, we don't want to work with CI or others. And I think part of the role that Peter took, and I embarked upon this also, is to try to resolve these acrimonies and fears and concerns between the two sides. And I know that some conservationists have also attempted to do that. So, have a more positive view of human rights. And there is, of course, some concern that human rights will, kind of overrule, conservation objectives and animal rights and environmental rights in some ways. But people like David Boyd have been great at putting this and trying to resolve that. So in terms of the outputs that we essentially have a forthcoming book. In June, it will come out. It's an edited volume with Routledge. We've got about 22 chapters, and it's a broad range of perspective, many of them coming from defenders themselves, the experiences, and others, it's essentially a mix of practitioners and researchers that are tackling a number of issues. So many, of course, are looking at the kind of political economies that lead to those killings, the power relations between local authorities, sometimes corruption, etc. There are a few papers that are chapters that are looking at conservation issues. For example, we've got Yannick Nyolo in Tanzania that shares experience of violence of Maasai communities in conservation areas and trying to find better ways of working in partnership with conservation organization. And in this respect, I think one of the things that come out quite strongly is the increasing value of looking at indigenous or traditional community conservation, so ICAS, etc. So we've got another chapters by Cora Sachs looking at that. So it's a very promising, it's also a very challenging area. So some of you who may be dealing with it in parents. So that's for the book. For the special issue of Policy Matters, as you know, it's the chief publication of the Commission, the CESP, and for that we had tremendous interest. We had to increase the volume from 1 to 3 because we had so much material, so many people wanted to talk about this issue. Why? In part because I think there are many people that are grassroots conservation oriented. Of course, CESP gathers people who are interested about the social and livelihood aspects of things. They really wanted to try to have a voice, and so volume 1 will cover essentially the different types of defenders that relate to conservation issues, and also the many phases of repression that they face, ranging from killings, but also much more subtle forms of violence. The second one is grassroots in action. And here it's essentially about looking at how people try to defend the environment that is not in the way that often the human rights community focuses on, which is the street protest, the blockades, all these things that generally pit communities against the public or private security apparatus at play. And that's often when we see things escalating into deadly violence. And grassroots in action is much more about saying, how can communities work towards conservation goals in soft, constructive approaches that do not build antagonism, in particular with authorities, because there is a reality very often is that the power imbalances are such that communities often are on the losing end of those struggles, of course. And the third one takes a broader perspective on, what could conservation do for, defenders' protections. And as I mentioned, a little bit of introspection, better coordination, some timely condemnation, and frankly also sometimes more it can be difficult, but addressing powerful donors, powerful politicians that are often manipulated conservation to provide a kind of good side to their otherwise quite harmful activities. So I'll leave it there, and so I've taken the names of people participating in the seminar and attending, and we'll be sending you a little note when the volumes are coming out. Thank you so much.
Oh, great! Thanks, Felipe. Thanks, Peter. That was a really great seminar, very eye-opening. I've got a few questions, but there is one question posted up in the chat box, and I'd encourage you to put up your hands or or type a question in there, and we'll get your question in. And I think what we should do is perhaps start with those questions first, and then I would be happy to talk about my thoughts and perspective about the society and how it might step into this arena. But the first question in the chat box is from Minnie, and the question reads, a year after that historic meeting, there have been more killings. So what is needed to be done now? Post-pandemic recovery plans will mean more threats because the battle for resources will be further intensified. Mm-hmm. And this is a question that was posted up in the middle of the seminar. So if you have thoughts on that question as we go.
Yeah.
It's an extremely, I'll let you jump in, Philippe, first, perhaps.
As you like, go ahead, but I've got cases, yeah. Okay, yeah, so this is a real concern. And as you know, if you follow commodity prices, it's already going on. As you know, China invested massively into infrastructure as a way of compensating for fear of a drop in exports in particular. And as such, the price of many commodities have gone up, oil included, and that has renewed interest on part of investors. And we know it's a boom and bust cycle, and we know that essentially when there is a anticipation of a boom or an ongoing boom, well, it means, you know, more prospection, more projects starting, an acceleration of the extractive projects. That means very often that consultations gets undermined, and that's not very good news. And often, of course, the government take less gloves when it's about to secure FDI, foreign direct investments, in those circumstances. So this is a real concern. At the same time, so I've got a student in Colombia who just spent a year in the Coca, and yes, there is a lot of concern about COVID creating a situation where all those defenders are sitting ducks, literally confined in their homes, not always protected by the communities. And so, yes, there are more killings. Possibly, we don't have the full stats yet for the year that will come up in July when we have a full aggregation. But communities have also been very tight, as you know, in those circumstances. Sometimes they benefited from greater autonomy, also as a result of confinement. Some projects have been slowed because of logistics, sanitary concerns. So the picture is quite mixed, but the overall, trend that Minnie Degawan is pointing at is actually a great concern. So what to do about it? I think there needs to be a lot of pressure on development banks, and I'm not talking only of the World Bank, but as you know, China is the leading lender for many of the countries of concern, including through the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. And for this, it is crucial that a strong message from the conservation community come through in saying, well, post-COVID economic recovery, it should not be, a blank check in order to, bypass, the many measures that we know are necessary in order for, those projects to work out economically. Because as we know, when conflicts escalate, it also, many companies bear massive costs in delays, in opposition, etc. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. I would perhaps add also the importance of the conservation community indeed standing together on this issue is now a key priority, because we have for the last, I would say, decades also ended up in fairly fragmented and divided conservation scene, where between mainstream organizations more in dialogue and protest organizations and so on, and which has left indeed many people in isolation and quite vulnerable, despite indeed sharing similar goals, but perhaps pursuing these goals through different strategies and means, and that's not going to change. But I do think that the ability to stand together and call for basic respect of human rights in these situations is extremely important and fundamental. And one of the things that we've also seen is that there's need for much better cross-fertilization between the human rights community and the conservation community in terms of how to address these issues. So that's the second bit of I would say opportunity as well to learn to work together better on these matters. And the third thing is, and this goes in line also with what Philippe is insisting upon, is really addressing the drivers behind all of this, and finding ways of not simply trying to save individuals, which of course is fundamental, but also sort of trying to take some of the drivers away that are pushing these situations to escalate. Because we see that they evolve over time, and there are particular moments to get in there. Now, what then to do in situations like you're facing, Minnie, in the Philippines, and how to address that is a very complex question. And I think that there have been very, very good attempts to try to work with international human rights processes. I think that international dialogue hopefully can be doing more, but of course it's how to actually stop the specific killings and so on is extremely challenging. Of course, also when you have very high levels of government supporting violence in some respects, no, and coming out with very strong statements against human rights. So this makes it, of course, very difficult.
Thanks. Can I pop in with a question?
Please.
Yeah, because just the comment that you made just now on the conservation community standing together, I think is a good segue to a question and a comment. So you talked about the IUCN and the convention and the CBD. One of the things I was expecting that you might also have mentioned, but you didn't, was the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on their potential role in this issue.
That's where I show that I'm not an expert in conservation.
Okay. No, I think absolutely it has a role to play, and in terms of its, again, the science policy linkages, yeah, in making sure that these issues are addressed, perhaps with specific reporting, with specific analysis that can be engaged on that. Again. Some reporting, of course, has been influential in that respect. So I think that's a very valid point and something to be pursued. Yeah. But I also think that in the immediate term, I think that from some actors also there's a feeling of saying we don't need more analysis, we need more action. But I think as part of what our research also shows is that indeed we do need more research, and there are a number of blind spots. There are a whole number of questions regarding about drivers and root causes and so on. So I think the documentation issue is there, and what we've seen is that very often from the human rights community, in some cases they have been pretty good at reaching out towards different types of environmental defenders, but there are also many that continue to go under the radar screen. So I think there is the issue of documentation, of scientific reports that can be mobilized more, and that can also go into looking at how basically perhaps to really address these concerns as an integral part. And here's also where I think our discussions and analysis showed that, for example, recent efforts to for example, address human rights dimensions of conservation had pursued other aspects. For example, the issue of local communities in protected areas, community tenure rights, and so on, but not necessarily looking at sort of the environmental human rights defender perspective. So I mean, there are different levels where you mentioned IPBES, but we can also look at sort of the broader set of social science research in the conservation field and look at how to actually contribute to this in many ways. And of course, I mean, a clear gap is in particular countries without very open civic spaces, where there's a lot of hesitancy, both from the side of researchers to document this and speak up about it, but also from defenders themselves to stand up and of course prefer anonymity and work under the radar themselves to avoid sort of being the kinds of sitting ducks that that Philippe also referenced just before. So in this kind of complexity, I think that there's a lot of careful navigation that needs to be done to reach out to people who are at risk, but also, of course, to address the root causes to reduce the risks at stake.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I mean, I think the timing with IPBES may not be great in that they've just released their whole series of first initial round of reports and structured their process for the next couple of years. But just while we were chatting, I went and looked up who are on the policy committee for the Society for Conservation Biology, and on that committee is a person, Carolyn Lundquist, who is also on a policy committee for IPBES, which made me think about this. And just this is the comment then, is that the Society formerly had a unified policy office, and it would have been an easy thing for that policy office to take this issue on. But the Society has, over the last 4 to 5 years, strongly decentralized because it was viewed as too North American, and which it was. And so we now have a decentralized policy process, which makes this a little bit more difficult to get on board with this thing, because it's actually all of the 9 regional chapters or sections that would need to come together for this. But Melissa Price is the chair of the policy committee, and it's certainly something that I think I'd be happy to bring up with her and see where we would go. You know, the Society for Conservation Biology is a science society. It's not an activist society, and it's very wary about getting into activism. But I think the hook that I think Felipe mentioned, Felipe mentioned the statistic of 40% of actions were against scientists or professionals, is, I think, a perfectly legitimate hook to say that it's something that affects our profession, and therefore something that we should be involved in. Okay, so I don't want to talk on further in that there are 2 messages. Let's see, Yves just says, IPBES was present at the March UNEP Geneva Environmental Network event on environmental defenders, so that's more of a comment. But then Bool Smuts has a question. Well, do you want to read that, or do you want me to do that? I can do that if you'd like.
Meet myself.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, no, I'm just sorry, I missed the beginning of the presentation, so I may be repeating things. I'm just very concerned. The reason I joined this discussion in South Africa, I'm seeing a trend where some of the abuse is coming from the government sector. And it really is relates around the adjudication and the handing out of these public goods, which essentially is wildlife, either botanical or faunal species, and how that system is abused in terms of lack of transparency, lack of sharing of information, fair administration, the right to speak out, and how people are victimized when they voice opinions. And in fact, my experience is that scientists are coerced into silent accomplices of the process, and I think it is a silent monster to fight, because where reason fails and where public advocacy fails, all you have to resort to is the mechanisms of the law. And I think in obviously constitutional democracies, there are stronger mechanisms to appeal to the law. And when you move down the ranks, as we are probably somewhere down the ranks, that battle becomes a lot harder. And one sees scientists disappear from that battle. And I actually believe that scientists joining such battles will give a strong impetus to fighting those causes. And I just see it absent in South Africa, and that's my concern. And I wanted to hear what your thoughts are of trying to co-opt willing scientists in these essentially constitutional battles about fair administration, access to information, fair adjudication of the allocation of these items to either researchers or people that harvest them and abuse them. So I'd just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
I think thank you for that. I think it's an absolutely fundamental issue to address. And of course, we were seeing multiple scientists being silenced or not being willing to speak up and or otherwise coerced into not sharing results. And we, if anyone in sort of the conservation related field, of course, face this in terms of, especially I think one thing that has made it particularly complex has also been the growing number of public and private entities that are somehow involved in reporting, you know, how well they're doing on environmental standards and whatnot. And in a sense, scientific studies very often may contradict those kind of reporting through careful analysis in many ways. So I think that getting back to Mark's thinking around really addressing this from a policy perspective, even if it has been decentralized as well, I think is absolutely fundamental at this stage. I mean, if we end up in a situation where researchers, like the situation you describe in South Africa, where you're no longer able to speak up about your research results and otherwise are experiencing these limitations to your constitutional rights and so on, we face a dramatic situation where it's going to be very difficult indeed to hope for any progress on biodiversity protection. So the scientific community here has a key role to play. I know there's major discussions about this also in other contexts, like of course UNESCO for the issue of science. But I do think that scientific associations like the society here have a role to play. And I would even say in a very basic way, in a sense that the regional processes, you mentioned, Mark, how it has been decentralized. I think, I mean, even having some kind of statements of support to reach out to these scientists that are facing these kind of situations in a very neutral manner to just uphold these basic principles of the rights to freedom of expression and engagement in scientific activity and so on is absolutely crucial. And I think it can make a difference, because as we've seen also is that the processes of isolation are ongoing and intensify as soon as you have controversial facts that may contradict reporting and so on. So maybe Philippe, you want to step in here, and also I know we're running out of time, but
yeah. So just, you know, from experience, I know there are a few things that can happen, and I think the society, you know, its policy branch could be monitoring these things and assisting researchers when they face particular problems, or on the contrary, encourage them to be a little bit more neutral when they have conflicts of interest. So one that we often see is where the government has decided to silence its own scientists, you know, the ones that it directs. And we've had that in Canada under the Harper government. Another situation is where essentially there are important financial conflicts of interest. Many of the people, even if they are not hired and working for the companies that they are reporting on the potential effects, etc., have future consultancies, have interest, etc. And you know, again, we've seen many cases where they hesitate to talk, even if they know. And then after, when we've got a problem, then privately they will tell you, yeah, I kind of saw it coming, but why didn't you do anything about it? Well, you know, difficult. A third point is sometimes, as you mentioned, Mark, as scientists, they always hesitate to take sides because the moment they do that, they also lose their credibility on the other side. There are many researchers who ally themselves with communities. They sometimes paid or they do it pro bono. And we see very often vicious attacks on the part of companies and governments at undermining their credibility precisely because they've worked with the communities. And to be frank, sometimes their work is tainted by the solidarity that they have with the communities. And so as a society, having rules of engagement, discussions, maybe help when it's needed, maybe something of really high value. And so generally the forms that we see is when there is a work among researchers themselves, they sign a petition among colleagues. That's the classic thing that we, trying to defend a colleague that is being attacked, or attacking or criticizing the government for silencing its own researchers, those types of things. So I think once environmental defenders are recognized not simply as activist communities looking at self-interest, but as part of the broader ecosystem of conservation in a planet that is facing a crisis, then there is more legitimacy at maybe not taking sides, but at least bringing science, into a more open and genuine and transparent debates. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, and we are running out of time. And I guess following on Bool's comments, I'd like to say that I think there are probably three, at least, avenues to try and engage this scientific community. One of them is through influential groups that we all pay attention to, things like IPBES and CBD and IUCN, things that you're doing, conservation NGOs. The second is through societies, which I think you've put your finger on how the SCB could engage in this, and I'm happy to bring this forward to the policy committee and talk to them about it. A third, I'd say, is very similar or right up the alley of what, Philippe, you're doing with the books that you're publishing. And that is those books will come out and they'll reach an audience. But our journals also reach an audience. And for example, the journal that I'm the editor for, Conservation Science and Practice, we have a section called Evidence. They're for short pieces for people to talk about their experiences. It's not really a science paper, but it would be a place where a defender could tell their story, and as long as it's sort of informing us as a conservation community. And I think that would be another way to reach a group of scientists is a little bit like a herd of cats, right? So you don't, so you want to put lots of tentacles out and reach them in many different ways. And I think that would be yet another way to reach that audience about how they could get engaged and involved in this really important issue that I want to thank you for presenting here today. So any final words before we shut the recording down and say goodbye to everybody? I'll leave the floor for you, the last word.
Well, I would just, on our behalf, indeed, thank you, Mark, for that response, indeed, also to our plea. And I think we're happy to continue that conversation also, perhaps with, if you want, a few of us together with the policy group, just to perhaps explore some ideas. And so happy to take that forward. Thanks again for the opportunity to present this. And we do hope that we can take this forward somehow. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and we really value it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, and thank you everybody for participating. We'll now stop the recording.
Okay. All right.